Close your eyes and imagine Warsaw in 1940, where the occupation is still new enough that resistance seems possible, where the full machinery of Nazi genocide has not yet revealed itself, where the underground movements are forming and recruiting and planning operations that might slow or sabotage or document the German control of Poland. The reports are filtering through from the camps, vague accounts of brutal conditions, of prisoners dying from starvation and disease and arbitrary violence, of facilities that seem designed not merely to imprison, but to systematically destroy, to eliminate populations through methods that are unclear because no one who enters these camps is allowed to leave. No witnesses emerge to testify about what happens behind the wire and the guard towers and the walls that hide atrocity from outside observation. Your name is Witold Pilecki. You are 39 years old, a cavalry officer in the Polish army before the invasion, a veteran of Poland's fight for independence in 1918, a man with wife and 2 children, and a family estate that has been confiscated by the occupiers. A resistance fighter who has spent the year since Poland's defeat organizing underground networks and conducting intelligence operations against the German administration. You are not reckless or suicidal or prone to dramatic gestures that sacrifice effectiveness for symbolism. You are methodical, strategic, someone who understands that resistance requires intelligence as much as courage, that fighting the occupation means knowing what the enemy is doing, documenting their crimes, gathering evidence that will matter when the world's attention can finally be directed toward what is happening in occupied Poland. And the resistance leadership has a problem. They need to know what is happening in Auschwitz. Not the rumors or the second-hand accounts or the speculation based on the transports that arrive and the prisoners who disappear, but first-hand intelligence about the camp's purpose and organization and the conditions that prisoners face, intelligence that can only be obtained by someone who enters the camp and survives long enough to report. The discussion about how to acquire this intelligence occurs in a safe house in Warsaw, among resistance commanders who understand they are contemplating sending someone on mission with survival probability approaching 0, who must ask one of their members to volunteer for capture and imprisonment in facilities specifically designed to kill prisoners through deliberate deprivation and systematic brutality. "We need a volunteer," the commander says, his voice carrying the weight of asking something that should not be askable, that violates every principle about protecting operatives and minimizing casualties, and not sacrificing valuable personnel on missions with minimal probability of success. Someone who can survive Auschwitz long enough to understand what is happening there, who can organize resistance inside the camp, who can document the crimes being committed and find ways to communicate that information to us, who can eventually escape and provide testimony about what the Germans are doing. The silence that follows is profound, uncomfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding that this mission is essentially death sentence, with the slim possibility of martyrdom serving intelligence purpose, that whoever volunteers will likely die in Auschwitz, and the only question is whether their death will produce information valuable enough to justify the sacrifice. You break the silence, not immediately, not impulsively, but after several minutes of considering the tactical requirements and the probability of success, and the simple calculation that someone must do this, and you possess the qualities that make success marginally more likely than if they send someone else. "I will go," you say, the words simple and final, not leaving room for discussion or second-guessing or the kind of extended debate that would make the decision harder for everyone involved. The commanders look at you with expressions mixing relief and horror, grateful that someone volunteered while understanding they have just accepted your offer to enter hell for purpose that might not even be achieved, that might result in your death without producing the intelligence that would make that death meaningful. The plan is developed over several weeks. You will engineer your own arrest by being present at a German roundup in Warsaw, will ensure you are captured during one of the random sweeps where the Germans arrest hundreds of Poles to fill labor quotas or to retaliate for resistance activities or simply to terrorize the population through arbitrary detention. The arrest is violent, casual, the kind of routine brutality that characterizes German occupation. Shouting and rifle butts and the systematic degradation that begins immediately and will continue until death or liberation, whichever comes first. You are transported with perhaps 2,000 other prisoners to Wehrmacht barracks in Warsaw, where you spend several days in overcrowded conditions without adequate food or sanitation, where the Germans conduct preliminary screening to identify Jews and intelligentsia and anyone else who falls into categories marked for special treatment, where the arbitrary nature of Nazi ideology determines fates based on ethnic classification and social status and the whims of officials reviewing files. You survive the screening, your false identity holding, your appearance and documentation convincing the German administrators that you are unremarkable Pole of no particular significance or threat. The transport to Auschwitz occurs on June 14, 1940. You are among the first mass transport of political prisoners sent to the camp, arriving when Auschwitz is still a relatively new facility, when it has not yet expanded into the vast killing complex it will become, when it functions primarily as a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners rather than as an extermination center for Jews and other populations the regime has marked for elimination. The arrival is deliberately traumatic, designed to break prisoners psychologically before the physical destruction begins. You are forced off the cattle cars, stripped of remaining possessions, beaten by SS guards and capos with clubs and whips, tattooed with prisoner number 4859 that replaces your name and identity, issued the striped uniform that marks you as camp inmate, subjected to the screaming and violence and systematic dehumanization that transforms people into numbers, into units of labor to be worked until they die, and then replaced with fresh numbers from the endless transports arriving daily.
The conditions are worse than anything the resistance intelligence suggested, worse than the rumors prepared you for, worse than you believed possible in 20th century Europe, supposedly governed by laws and international conventions and the basic minimum of human decency. The prisoners sleep in overcrowded barracks on wooden bunks without mattresses or blankets, are fed starvation rations deliberately insufficient to sustain life for more than a few months, work 12-hour shifts at hard labor designed to exhaust and injure and kill through accumulated trauma and exposure and the simple mathematics of caloric intake versus expenditure. The violence is constant, arbitrary, delivered by SS guards and capos who have been giving authority to beat and kill prisoners without accountability or restraint, who exercise that authority enthusiastically because the camp's culture rewards brutality and punishes any sign of mercy or hesitation. You survive the first weeks through combination of physical resilience and psychological preparation, and the understanding that your mission requires endurance rather than resistance, requires you to observe and remember and document, rather than to fight back against violence that would crush any open rebellion. The deaths around you are constant, prisoners collapsing from exhaustion during forced labor, prisoners beaten to death for infractions, real or imagined, prisoners dying from disease and starvation, and the accumulated trauma of conditions designed to kill without the efficiency of gas chambers or firing squads, killing through the slow, grinding destruction of human bodies subjected to deliberate deprivation. You begin to understand that Auschwitz is not merely prison or labor camp, but is institution designed for systematic murder, facility where the stated purpose of detention and labor is cover for actual purpose of eliminating prisoners through methods that allow the regime to maintain the fiction that deaths are natural consequences of detention rather than deliberate policy of extermination. The realization is both horrifying and clarifying. Horrifying because it reveals the full extent of Nazi evil. Clarifying because it defines your mission with precision that removes any ambiguity about what intelligence needs to be gathered and communicated. You begin organizing, carefully, slowly, identifying other prisoners who possess the mental clarity and physical stamina to participate in resistance activities, who have not been entirely broken by the camp's brutality, who retain capacity for organized action beyond mere survival. The recruitment is dangerous. Approaching the wrong prisoner could mean denunciation to the SS, could mean torture and execution for you and anyone associated with you, could destroy the mission before it produces any intelligence value. But the risk is necessary because you cannot accomplish the mission alone, cannot gather comprehensive intelligence or organize effective resistance or establish communication channels without network of trusted collaborators.
The organization you create, later called Związek Organizacji Wojskowe, the union of military organizations, grows slowly, recruiting prisoners who can serve different functions within the camp resistance structure. Some gather intelligence about camp operations, about the arrival and processing of transports, about the construction of new facilities that will expand Auschwitz's capacity. Some organize sabotage of German equipment and production, subtle acts that slow the camp's efficiency, without creating obvious evidence that would trigger reprisals. Some maintain morale among prisoners, provide psychological support that helps people endure beyond the point where endurance seems possible, preserve the humanity that the camp is designed to destroy. Most critically, some establish communication channels to the outside world. This is the essential component of your mission. Intelligence that cannot be communicated is worthless. Documentation that remains trapped inside the camp serves no purpose beyond your own knowledge of atrocities you cannot prevent. The communication channels are elaborate, dangerous, depend on civilian workers who enter the camp for construction or delivery, on Polish resistance members who can receive messages smuggled out and transmit them to London, where the Polish government in exile can bring international attention to what is happening at Auschwitz. You write reports in microscopic handwriting on scraps of paper obtained through the camp's black market, describing the conditions and the death rates and the systematic nature of the killing, providing the kind of detailed first-hand testimony that can counter German propaganda claiming the camps are humane detention facilities. The reports are smuggled out through laundry being sent for cleaning, through supplies being delivered, through the network of contacts that your organization has painstakingly established over months of careful work. But the communication faces fundamental problem. The world does not believe. The reports reaching London describe atrocities so extreme that they seem like propaganda or exaggeration, describe systematic murder on scale that seems impossible to implement, describe conditions that violate so completely the basic assumptions about civilized behavior that Allied governments and journalists dismiss them as resistance fabrications designed to generate sympathy and support. You are telling the truth, providing accurate first-hand intelligence about genocide and progress, and the recipients conclude you must be lying because the truth is too terrible to accept. The frustration is profound, but you continue the work because documentation matters even when immediate response is not forthcoming, because preserving the evidence for eventual accountability requires recording what is happening even when the recording cannot prevent it, because bearing witness is moral obligation that transcends tactical calculation about whether the witness will be believed. The camp expands around you. New sections are constructed, new gas chambers and crematoria are built to increase the killing capacity. The transports shift from primarily Polish political prisoners to primarily Jews being brought from across occupied Europe for immediate extermination. The nature of Auschwitz transforms from concentration camp into death camp, from facility designed to kill prisoners slowly through labor and deprivation into facility designed to kill them immediately upon arrival through industrial-scale gassing. You witness the arrival of Hungarian Jews in 1944. Watch as entire trainloads of people are unloaded and sorted on the ramp. Watch as the majority, the elderly and children, and anyone deemed unfit for labor, are sent directly to the gas chambers. Watch as the minority selected for work are processed into the camp where they will die more slowly through the same combination of starvation and disease and violence that has been killing prisoners since the camp opened. The scale is overwhelming, incomprehensible. The machinery of genocide operating with efficiency that demonstrates careful planning and systematic implementation, that proves the extermination is not spontaneous violence or the actions of individual sadists, but is coordinated policy implemented with bureaucratic precision. Your reports become more detailed, more urgent, describing the gas chambers and the crematoria and the selection process, providing the kind of specific intelligence that should force international response, that should generate outcry and intervention and the deployment of resources to stop what is happening. But still, the world does not act. Still, the Allies prioritize military objectives over rescue operations. Still, the trains arrive and the killing continues, and your documentation accumulates without producing the intervention that might save lives rather than merely recording their destruction. The psychological toll of witnessing genocide while being unable to prevent it, of organizing resistance that can sabotage equipment and maintain morale but cannot stop the gas chambers, of surviving while thousands die around you daily, would break most people. You maintain focus through the discipline of military training and the understanding that the mission requires your survival, that dying in the camp means the intelligence dies with you, that endurance serves purpose beyond mere self-preservation.
April 1943. You have been in Auschwitz for nearly 3 years, longer than most prisoners survive, longer than your body should have been able to endure the starvation and disease and brutal labor. The intelligence network you established is functioning. The reports are being smuggled out regularly. The documentation of genocide is being compiled and transmitted to London, where it joins the growing body of evidence about Nazi crimes that will eventually be used for prosecution and historical record, even if it cannot generate the immediate intervention you hoped for. But you recognize that your continued presence in the camp is becoming counterproductive. You have gathered the intelligence, organized the resistance, established the communication channels, and now your survival is increasingly improbable.
Your usefulness is diminishing as your physical condition deteriorates and the probability of discovery increases with each passing month. You plan your escape with the same methodical care that characterized your infiltration and your resistance activities. Escaping Auschwitz is nearly impossible. The camp is surrounded by multiple fences, patrolled by guards with dogs and machine guns, monitored from towers that provide overlapping fields of fire, designed specifically to prevent the escapes that would allow witnesses to testify about what is happening. But nearly impossible is not completely impossible, and you have advantages that most prisoners lack. You have a network of collaborators inside the camp. You have intelligence about guard routines and patrol patterns. You have contacts on the outside who can provide assistance if you can reach them. You have the military training and the physical conditioning that make survival after escape more probable than for prisoners who have been completely broken by their captivity. The escape plan involves the bakery outside the main camp complex, where you have been assigned to work detail, where the security is slightly less intense than inside the camp proper, where there are moments during shift changes when supervision lapses briefly. You and two other prisoners, Jan Redze and Edward Cicielski, both members of your resistance organization, wait for the optimal moment when the guards are distracted and the patrol patterns create temporary gap in observation. The escape occurs on the night of April 26th to 27th, 1943. You cut through wire fence, evade the initial search, reach the Solar River where you cross using routes scouted during previous work details, move through the countryside towards safe houses that resistance contacts have established for exactly this purpose. The first hours are the most dangerous. You are close enough to Auschwitz that a massive manhunt can still catch you. You are wearing prisoner uniform that marks you immediately as an escapee if you encounter German patrols or Polish civilians who might inform. You are weakened from 3 years of camp conditions and struggling to cover the distance necessary to reach safety before exhaustion or discovery ends the attempt. But you reach the first safe house, receive civilian clothes and food, and the assistance that allows you to continue the journey toward Warsaw, toward the resistance leadership that sent you into Auschwitz, and who need the comprehensive debriefing you can now provide, who need the first-hand testimony that can confirm and expand the reports that have been smuggled out piecemeal over the years. The escape is successful. You are one of the few prisoners to escape Auschwitz and survive to provide detailed testimony about what is happening inside. One of the rare witnesses who can describe the genocide from first-hand observation rather than from rumors or second-hand accounts. The debriefing in Warsaw takes weeks, requires you to document everything you witnessed in detail that can be used for intelligence purposes and eventual war crimes prosecution, requires you to describe the camp's organization and the selection process and the gas chambers and crematoria and the systematic nature of the extermination, requires you to provide the kind of comprehensive testimony that no other source can provide because no other source has your combination of military training and 3 years inside Auschwitz and successful escape that allows the testimony to reach audiences that matter. The report you produce, Report 1, later known as Untold's report, is one of the first detailed accounts of Holocaust in progress, provides documentation of genocide while it is still occurring rather than after the fact, includes the kind of specific intelligence about Auschwitz's operations that should force Allied governments to acknowledge what is happening and to take action to stop it. The report reaches London through resistance channels, is translated and distributed to Polish government in exile, and through them to British and American authorities who now cannot claim ignorance, who now have detailed testimony from a credible source about the systematic murder of millions. But still the response is inadequate. The Allies acknowledge the report, incorporate its intelligence into their understanding of Nazi crimes, use the information for planning post-war prosecution of war criminals. But they do not bomb the gas chambers, do not bomb the rail lines leading to Auschwitz, do not divert military resources from strategic objectives to rescue operations that might save some of the people being murdered daily in the camp you escaped from. The tactical justifications are offered. Bombing would be difficult, might kill prisoners, might not be effective, would divert aircraft from missions targeting German industrial capacity. But underneath the tactical arguments is the fundamental reality that the Allies have decided that winning the war takes precedence over rescuing its victims, that strategic bombing of German cities and factories matters more than attempting to disrupt the extermination process, that the Jews and Poles and Roma being killed at Auschwitz are not sufficient priority to justify the diversion of resources.
You resume fighting with the Polish resistance, participate in the Warsaw Uprising in August 1944, when the city rises against the occupiers in a desperate attempt to liberate itself before Soviet forces arrive and impose their own occupation. The uprising fails, is crushed by German forces after 63 days of brutal urban combat, after the Soviets deliberately halt their advance and allow the Germans to destroy the Polish resistance that might have opposed Soviet control after the war. You survive the uprising's collapse, go into hiding during the German reprisals, emerge when Soviet forces finally enter Warsaw in January 1945 and establish control over what remains of the city. But Soviet occupation proves as dangerous as German occupation for someone with your history. The communist regime views the Polish resistance, the home army that fought the Germans, as threat to Soviet control, arrests its members as potential counter-revolutionaries, begins purging Poland of people who might resist communist rule with the same determination they resisted Nazi occupation. You are arrested by Soviet security services in 1947, charged for spying for Western powers, subjected to a show trial that is designed not to establish guilt or innocence, but to eliminate resistance leadership and intimidate anyone who might oppose the new regime. The interrogation is brutal, involves torture designed to extract confession and to break your will, to force you to implicate others in conspiracies, real or fabricated, to destroy the resistance networks through combination of execution and intimidation. You resist initially, maintain that you are loyal Pole who fought against Nazi occupation and who has no involvement in conspiracies against communist government. But the torture continues, the isolation and sleep deprivation and physical abuse accumulate, and eventually you confess to charges you know are false, sign statements implicating yourself and others in crimes you did not commit, provide the testimony that the regime needs to justify the executions they have already decided to carry out. May 25th, 1948, you are executed by firing squad in Mokotów prison in Warsaw, killed by the communist regime you fought to free from Nazi occupation, murdered for the crime of being too independent and too capable and too likely to resist if allowed to survive. You are 47 years old, survived Auschwitz and the Warsaw Uprising and 3 years of underground resistance, survived the Nazis only to be killed by the Soviets, proved that surviving genocide does not guarantee surviving its aftermath, that victory over one totalitarian regime can be followed immediately by subjugation to another.
Your death is classified. Your story suppressed by the communist regime that cannot acknowledge the heroism of Home Army members without undermining the narrative that the Soviets were Poland's liberators rather than its new occupiers. Your family is harassed. Your name is erased from official histories. Your report about Auschwitz is buried in archives where it cannot challenge the communist version of events, where it cannot provide evidence that Polish resistance operated independently and effectively throughout the war, where it cannot demonstrate that there were Poles who fought both the Nazis and the Soviets with equal determination to preserve their nation's independence. The suppression lasts for decades. Your widow and children live under surveillance, marked by association with executed traitor, denied opportunities and subjected to harassment designed to punish them for your resistance and to discourage others from following your example. Your name becomes forbidden, mentioned only in whispers among former resistance members who remember what you did but cannot speak openly about it without risking their own safety, who preserve the memory through oral tradition and hidden documents but cannot publicly honor the man who volunteered for Auschwitz and survived to testify about genocide, and then was murdered by a regime claiming to represent Polish interests. The political transformation in Poland during the 1980s finally allows your story to emerge from suppression. Solidarity movement challenging communist control creates space for recovering suppressed history, for acknowledging the Home Army's role in fighting the occupation, for recognizing that Polish resistance was not simply Soviet-sponsored partisan activity, but was independent movement with its own goals and methods and heroes whose achievements the regime deliberately obscured. Your file is opened, your trial records are examined, and the fabricated nature of the charges becomes obvious to anyone reviewing the evidence without ideological commitment to maintaining communist narratives. The rehabilitation is gradual but comprehensive. In 1990, your conviction is formally overturned by Polish courts that acknowledge the show trial was politically motivated persecution rather than legitimate judicial proceeding, that you were innocent of the charges that led to your execution, that the regime that killed you was a criminal enterprise rather than legitimate government. In 1995, you are posthumously promoted to colonel in recognition of your service and your sacrifice, receiving the rank you would have achieved if your career had not been interrupted by volunteering for Auschwitz and then ended by communist execution. In 2006, you are awarded Poland's highest military decoration, the Order of the White Eagle, joining the ranks of national heroes whose service defined Polish resistance and whose sacrifice preserved the nation's identity through the darkest period of its history. In 2013, the beatification process begins within the Catholic Church, recognizing not just your military service, but your moral courage, your willingness to enter hell to document evil, your maintenance of faith and humanity under conditions designed to destroy both. But the most important recognition is the recovery and publication of Untold's report, the comprehensive account of Auschwitz that you compiled after your escape, the first-hand testimony that documented genocide while it was occurring and which Allied governments received but did not act upon with the urgency the situation demanded. The report is translated into multiple languages, published in editions that reach audiences worldwide, studied by historians and Holocaust scholars, and anyone seeking to understand how the extermination was organized and implemented and observed by someone who experienced it directly, rather than learning about it after liberation. The report reveals details that other accounts miss: the evolution of Auschwitz from concentration camp to extermination center, the development of the gas chambers and crematoria that industrialized killing, the selection process that determined who would die immediately and who would die slowly through labor and starvation, the resistance network you organized inside the camp and the intelligence it gathered and the communication channels it established, The report also reveals your psychological struggle with witnessing genocide while being unable to prevent it, with surviving while thousands died around you daily, with maintaining the discipline necessary to complete the mission while your humanity screamed at the injustice and the scale and the systematic nature of the evil. Modern historians studying the Holocaust recognize your report as one of the most important primary sources about Auschwitz's operations, as evidence that detailed information about the genocide was available to Allied governments years before liberation, as proof that the claim of ignorance, the assertion that the full extent of Nazi crimes was not known until the camps were captured, was false, that intelligence existed but was not believed or was not prioritized sufficiently to generate intervention. This historical recognition does not change what happened, does not resurrect the millions who died while your reports were being dismissed or ignored, but it does establish the record clearly for future generations, ensures that the question, "How could no one have known?" is answered with the truth. They knew, you told them, and they chose not to act. Your legacy extends beyond the historical record into the realm of moral philosophy and the ethics of resistance. You volunteered for a mission that was nearly certain to kill you, accepted 3 years of suffering and trauma and witnessing genocide, organized resistance that could sabotage and document but could not prevent, escaped and reported, and then continued fighting until you were killed, not by the Nazis you resisted, but by the Soviets who claimed to be liberating Poland. The sequence of events raises profound questions about the nature of heroism and whether voluntary suffering for intelligence purposes is justified when that intelligence is not acted upon, about whether bearing witness serves purpose beyond the immediate tactical when the witness is not believed, about whether maintaining humanity and organizing resistance inside genocide is meaningful resistance or merely makes the evil slightly less total. These questions have no simple answers, no formulas that resolve the tension between acknowledging that your mission failed to generate the intervention you hoped for, while simultaneously recognizing that the documentation and the resistance and the testimony were essential acts of moral courage that preserved human dignity in circumstances designed to eliminate it. You were not able to stop Auschwitz, but you documented it, organized resistance within it, survived to testify about it, provided evidence that eventually contributed to historical understanding and legal accountability, even if it could not save the people dying while you were gathering the intelligence.
1917. The monument to you in Warsaw, dedicated in 2006, depicts you in military uniform, standing at attention, carrying yourself with the dignity and discipline that characterized your service despite the conditions you endured. The inscription quotes your own words: "To try to do the right thing, to try to preserve one's dignity in circumstances that are designed to strip you of both, that is the challenge." The words capture something essential about your understanding of resistance, about the belief that maintaining moral standards and human decency matters, even when doing so accomplishes nothing tangible, even when the right thing to do leads to suffering and death, even when the system you are resisting continues functioning regardless of your resistance. Your story is taught in schools across Poland and increasingly in educational programs worldwide about Holocaust resistance and the moral complexity of fighting genocide, about the different forms that resistance can take when conventional military opposition is impossible, about the courage required to volunteer for suffering when the purpose of that suffering is documentation rather than direct action.
students struggle with the same questions that confronted you, whether entering Auschwitz voluntarily was heroic or whether it was sacrifice that could not be justified by the intelligence gathered, whether organizing resistance that could not prevent the genocide was meaningful, or whether it merely made the participants feel they were doing something, when structural change required external intervention that never came. But the educators emphasize that your choice was not binary between heroism and futility, that the mission served multiple purposes even when it did not achieve the primary objective of generating Allied intervention. You documented the genocide with precision that other sources could not match, provided testimony that became essential historical record, organized resistance that maintained human dignity and mutual support under conditions designed to destroy both, demonstrated that even in Auschwitz, moral choice remained possible, that prisoners retained agency even when that agency could not save lives, but could only determine how those lives ended and what meaning could be extracted from suffering that was otherwise senseless. But the educators emphasized that your choice was not binary between heroism and futility, that the mission served multiple purposes, even when it did not achieve the primary objective of generating Allied intervention. You documented the genocide with precision that other sources could not match, provided testimony that became essential historical record, organized resistance that maintained human dignity and mutual support under conditions designed to destroy both, demonstrated that even in Auschwitz, moral choice remained possible, that prisoners retained agency even when that agency could not save lives but could only determine how those lives ended and what meaning could be extracted from suffering that was otherwise senseless. The resistance network you created inside Auschwitz continued operating after your escape, continued gathering intelligence and organizing support and maintaining the communication channels you established, contributed to the survival of prisoners who benefited from the mutual aid and the morale support and the simple knowledge that they were not entirely abandoned, that someone was documenting what was happening and preserving the evidence for eventual accountability. This continuation demonstrates that your work created something larger than individual mission, created infrastructure that served purposes beyond your original objectives, created a legacy of resistance that inspired others to maintain dignity and humanity despite conditions designed to eliminate both. Your widow lived until 1989, long enough to see the communist regime collapse, long enough to witness the beginning of your rehabilitation and the recovery of your story from decades of suppression, long enough to know that the truth about your service and your sacrifice was finally being acknowledged publicly rather than whispered privately among former resistance members who remembered but could not speak. She gave interviews near the end of her life, describing the man you were before Auschwitz, the husband and father, the cavalry officer with strong Catholic faith, the person who volunteered for the mission knowing he might never return, but believing the intelligence was essential, the man who came back changed but not broken, who survived Auschwitz and continued fighting until the communists killed him for the crime of being incorruptible. Your children carry the complicated legacy of being descended from hero who was executed as traitor, whose rehabilitation came too late for them to know him, but not too late to reclaim his memory and ensure his story is preserved and taught. They participate in commemorations, speak at schools and museums, maintain the foundation that bears your name and which supports Holocaust education and research into resistance movements, Ensure that future generations understand not just what you did, but why it mattered. Why volunteering for Auschwitz was rational decision rather than suicidal gesture. Why documenting genocide serves purpose even when documentation does not prevent it. The question that survives you, that continues to challenge everyone who learns your story, is whether you would make the same choice if you knew then what you learned later, that the intelligence you gathered would not generate Allied intervention, that the reports you smuggled out would not be believed or acted upon with the urgency the situation demanded, that you would survive Auschwitz only to be executed by the regime that replaced Nazi occupation. Would you still volunteer for the mission if you knew the outcome? Would you still enter the camp if you understood that the testimony you provided would matter primarily for historical record rather than for immediate rescue? Your own words suggest the answer. In letters written after the war, before your arrest by Soviet security services, you reflected on the Auschwitz mission and concluded that bearing witness was its own justification, that documenting evil serves moral purpose beyond tactical calculation about whether the documentation generates immediate response, that maintaining human dignity under conditions designed to destroy it is form of resistance that matters regardless of strategic outcome. Someone had to do it, you wrote. Someone had to see and survive and testify. That the testimony was not believed is a tragedy, but it would have been a greater tragedy if no one had tried to provide it, if the genocide had occurred without any contemporary witness, if the victims had died without anyone documenting their suffering and preserving evidence for eventual accountability. This philosophy, that moral action has value independent of practical outcomes, that attempting to do the right thing matters even when the attempt fails to achieve intended results, defines your legacy more powerfully than the specific intelligence you gathered or the resistance you organized. You demonstrated that humans retain moral agency even in circumstances designed to eliminate it, that choice remains possible even when all available choices involve suffering and sacrifice, that volunteering for hell in service to truth and justice and the preservation of human dignity is a rational act rather than a meaningless martyrdom. The world you tried to warn did not listen. The genocide continued. Millions died in the camps you documented. The intervention you hoped your intelligence would generate never materialized during the time when it might have saved lives rather than merely avenging deaths. But the documentation survived. The testimony endured. The evidence you gathered was eventually used for prosecution and historical record, and the example you set of voluntary suffering in service to bearing witness inspires generations who face their own choices about when resistance requires sacrifice and whether maintaining moral standards serves purpose beyond immediate tactical advantage. If this story shook you, if it challenged your understanding of heroism and resistance and whether voluntary suffering can be justified when it serves documentation rather than prevention, engage with it. Leave a comment. Would you volunteer for Auschwitz if you believed the intelligence might stop the genocide? Does bearing witness serve purpose when the witness is not believed? Can resistance that cannot prevent atrocity still be meaningful resistance? Subscribe to this channel for more stories about moral courage under impossible circumstances, about the individuals who chose suffering over safety in service to truth and justice, about the complicated legacy of resistance that did not prevent the crimes it opposed, but documented them for history and accountability. Hit the like button if you believe we told Pilecki's sacrifice deserves recognition, if you think his voluntary entry into Auschwitz represents one of history's most extraordinary acts of moral courage,
If you understand that documenting genocide while it occurs serves essential purpose even when documentation does not generate immediate intervention. Pilecki volunteered for Auschwitz when no one ordered him to go. He organized resistance inside the camp when resistance seemed impossible. He documented genocide while it was happening and the world refused to believe. He survived to testify and was murdered for remaining incorruptible. His story is not comfortable. It does not offer easy lessons about good triumphing over evil, but it demonstrates that moral choice persists even in darkest circumstances, that some people choose truth over safety, that bearing witness matters even when the witness is not believed. Remember him. Remember what he chose. Remember that courage sometimes means volunteering for suffering when the only reward is the knowledge that you tried, that you documented, that you refused to let evil proceed without witness. That matters. That endures. That is the legacy.